We're in the home stretch here. We have one last panel, and then we're really looking forward to a keynote address from Kate Bingham, and that'll be followed by some awards and a big party across the street afterwards. So let's get started. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our next panel moderator, Farah Gertis from Wilson Sonsini, Goodrich, and Rosati. If you guys don't know this law firm, it's really one of the premier legal advisors to technology, life sciences, and growth enterprises worldwide. Wilson Sonsini is a valued partner of Yale's. There's a number of things that they are doing with us, and we appreciate that, and a leading sponsor of this summit. So Farah, thank you for your support. Thank you for organizing this panel entitled Business Development and Partnership. Is there an ideal time? And let's get everybody on stage and take your seats here.
We'll recap it. Yeah.
Farah, you're at the
All right.
You guys are all seated according to like the picture up there. So,
okay.
Peter, you're down at the end.
Yale.
Get everybody.
Where's Claire?
All right, so we are actually not
Claire,
doing
here's yours.
biotech partnering. We're
Sarah, you
doing
sit here also.
what's hot in biotech investment and why, although it'll be a little bit of a variation on that theme. We've got some folks who are involved in investing and advising companies at different points in their life cycle in life sciences or biotech space. So we've got a great panel that has a good range of perspectives to share with you today. And we may just start off with some quick introductions, and then we're going to go into some example investments or engagements that they have been involved in recently to give you a sense of what they're interested in, and we'll take it from there. So maybe, Jim, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you. I'm Jim Redick, and I run the research and investments group at Royalty Pharma, and that's the group that sources and analyzes our new investments, and we're about a $16 billion fund that invests in royalty streams, as you might expect from the name, but that's actually a mix between royalty streams that kind of exist already from a university or a small biotech company, and it's on the market by a marketer, and we go back and buy the royalty from the original innovator. But it's a mix between that and also royalties that we create ourselves on products as a way of funding the clinical trials of that product and getting that product to market, which is actually what I'll talk about a little later today, because I think that's really the innovation in our model these days, and the kind of interesting way that we fit into the investment continuum.
I'm Alex Zisson. I'm a partner at HIG Capital, and HIG is a big family of funds. I think we have $31 billion under management. And across the firm, healthcare is actually the biggest area that we do. Most of our sister funds are generalist funds that happen to do a lot of healthcare, but we have one sector fund, which is a healthcare fund that I help run. And we sort of run the gamut from venture capital to growth equity, to small buyout opportunities, and public company investments also.
Okay, Pete?
Sure. I am Pete Bach. I'm a VP at Back Bay Life Science Advisors. I think I am the only non-VC here on the panel, but we are a integrated strategy consulting and transaction advisory firm. So we do strategy consulting services from companies all the way to global pharma to pre-seed startups that are being incubated in academia. And then we also have a transaction advisory boutique investment bank function where we serve as advisors to both buy and sell side clients looking to enact either a licensing or M&A event.
Great, thank you. Jason?
So Jason Hafler, work for Sanofi Ventures. We're the corporate venture arm for Sanofi. And we'll talk a little bit about it later, but we're slightly different than other institutional funds in the fact that we're 100% strategic. So our parent company is a 100 plus or minus $1 billion market cap company, 40 or so billion in revenue. And so for us to return a top quartile fund, it won't move the needle for EPS or market cap. So we want to find opportunities that are early stage, typically seed or Series A, high strategic interest, where we invest, no strings attached, build a relationship, and ultimately try to partner or acquire the company down the road.
Thank you. Claire?
Yeah, hi, I'm Claire Leron. I am working for Samson Venture. We are as well as Redick, and we are working for the Samsung conglomerate. And so as you may know, it's a very diverse group of companies, mostly known for the mobile electronics business, but there's as well financial service. And we have biologics, manufacturing, and biosimilar. And so our job, so Samsung Venture Investment Corporation has been around for 20 years. But most of our investments so far have been in other areas than healthcare. We've been a little bit present in the wellness, but we are really starting now to tackle healthcare and life science as a next opportunity. So that's strategic mostly.
Thank you. Mike?
I'm Mike Dial. I'm a partner at Hatteras Venture Partners. We're seed and early stage healthcare investors based in Durham, North Carolina. We invest across healthcare. About half of what we do is biotech, which is where I focus. We also invest in devices and some diagnostics and healthcare IT. We're investing out of our sixth fund, which we just had a first close on of $94 million a couple of weeks back. And we've done one Yale startup company. And so would love to do more. John Soderstrom and Bill Weissler are gentlemen and true professionals, and so we've enjoyed working with them. Would love to do more, and glad to be here.
Great. So we've had a really good day. We have the good fortune or bad fortune of being at the end of that day, so we'll try to keep it lively.
Now, we allowed to move this outside?
Yeah, exactly, in the sunshine. So speaking of outside, after lunch, we had a great keynote speaker that hit on some of the trends that are current in biotech, including the importance of target identification and validation. There are a lot of companies moving into that space. The use of AI in biotech and in personalizing medicine, products versus platform plays. And really the core question for this group is, where do we see the real value creation? So I'm going to look to each of you to talk about some examples of that, maybe hitting on what stage you like to invest in companies or advise companies, what you're looking for. Is it people? Is it the technology? Is it a particular unmet need that you're looking to fill? Is it something else or some combination of those things? And maybe just touch on as well, given we had an earlier panel on collaborations, where do you see the value in those collaborations, if they have happened or not, when you think about investing in companies? So I think we'll start on the front end with Pete, because he serves an advisory role, and maybe you can talk about how you advise companies when they're looking toward their first investment.
Sure. So a lot of the function that we serve, especially with companies still at the seed stage, pre-Series A, is really helping them understand where to take the technology or discoveries and really help them to tell the story about how this eventually is going to be a product, just beyond what target you're looking at, why it's interesting, what specific function it will serve within the treatment paradigm for a disease or the specific diseases. And I think, we had talked earlier a little perspective about, what we find our clients are being pushed on or asked to have answered, when they're in discussions with their Series A venture round. It's increasingly turning to a lot of market-focused questions, especially if it's a very, very novel and, for lack of a better term, I hate to use it, disruptive technology. And so one good example actually was a company we advised that HIG eventually made the investment in OnTarget.
Yeah.
Right, and this was a company that had a sort of a very interesting novel optical technology in the surgical oncology space, and they had very good data. They were in phase 1 and looking to fund that next stage of trials, and they had been funded. They had a non-traditional VC group, to say the least, initially, and sort of funded on a lot of startup friends and family. And the key question that came up again and again with this hospital-based product that spanned both oncology, surgical applications was, what's the business model for the hospitals, how is it going to get paid for, and what's the economic model in the early stages post-launch. Not necessarily what the price point is going to be, but what's the value proposition to the end users in the hospital. And so, especially for innovative technologies, especially on the inpatient side, that's becoming more and more of a question that earlier and earlier people are looking to get a perspective and an answer.
Terrific, thank you. And maybe we'll hand it off to Alex then, since you had some overlap with Pete.
Yeah, and I mean, OTL, on-target labs, is a classic thing that we would do. HIG is a little broadly contrarian and value-oriented, so it's funny, I'm sort of a perverse choice for the panel, given, if an area is really hot, we kind of want to stay away from it, usually because it means prices are too high, and trying to figure out what's going to be hot a few years from now when we're getting ready to sell. But so I'd say normally we want to see some sort of proof of concept in humans. If we really fall in love with something, we can squint and sort of look at that, very broadly. But we always joke, if the business plan is sort of, hey, let's give $50 million to Professor McFamous. He has some, good ideas, and let's figure out if we can do something with it. That probably won't be a fit for us. But anything quirky, like OTL, which sort of paints tumors so that you can visualize them when you're trying to remove them. We did one of our most recent investments was with, actually, I don't know, Shandeep Agarwal, you still here from Longitude? We did it with Longitude, but it was a drug that's been on the market in Europe and Asia, for 20 or 30 years, and it tripped a carcinogenicity signal, so it's never been approved in the States, but we thought we had a way around it, but it had already been tried in one phase 3 trial and failed, but we thought they did that wrong, so we were taking another hack at it. So, the more complicated a product is, kind of the more we're interested now. 99 times out of 100, you look into it and you're like, this really is, not worth doing. But, and back to your earlier question, partially because we don't do the kind of the very early stage science, we really would never sort of make a bet on people to figure it out. And especially over the long run, it's rare that the same type of management team is the right guys or gals to run it throughout the entire development course. So, if it's a great asset, but we think maybe it needs a different management team, a lot of venture guys kind of stay away from that. It's where you learn, like, Venture 101, like, bet on the people, bet on the people. Mm-hmm. It's much easier to find people and bring them to a great asset than find a great asset, that's just hanging around out there. There aren't too many of those.
What about the validation of a collaboration? Does that weigh into your calculus, or is it really just the data starting to see?
Yeah, it depends. To the extent we can piggyback off a lot of diligence that someone did, and they did a ton of diligence, and they know the area super well, maybe. And it's a big investment, but if it's, like OTL, JJDC came in, and, that was interesting to us, because we were trying to figure out who the buyer is. Is it a hospital drug buyer? Is it a device? Is it a camera maker? Is it a contrast agent? So it was sort of interesting to hear their point of view on all that.
Okay.
But it wasn't so much like, oh, J&J's in this, let's jump in.
Good. So Jason, maybe you can tell us about how Sanofi thinks about its strategic investments, and it sounds like you probably do come in a little bit earlier.
For sure. So we as a fund typically will go seed Series A, but as we think about hot areas, I actually hate that, right? Because so often when you think about hot areas, you're exactly what we're talking about is you're overpaying for something, right? Several examples of history, right? Where we as a strategic fund ultimately want to have things come back into Sanofi. So you think about recent companies like Moderna, Alnylam back in the early 2000s, right? The gene editing, right? These are things that we've passed on, ultimately can be great venture investments, but aren't going to lead to products that are come back into our corporate, our parent company. So what we like to do is, I'll give an example of a recent company that we seeded and ultimately brought in several other investors into the Expansion Therapeutics. Expansion is a company out of Matt Disney's lab focused on targeting RNA tertiary structure with small molecules. Now, we understand small molecule drug development, right? Like we can do that. And so going after RNA with small molecules is something that made sense to us, and they're really becoming a DM1 solutions, myotonic dystrophy solutions company. And so that was something where we're doing something novel on the fact that you're targeting RNA tertiary structure with small molecules that make sense for us.
Can you talk about investments in companies like Evidation, like database companies, and how you think about those as being strategic for Sanofi?
For sure. So a couple years ago, I think pharma is realizing what they're good at and some things maybe they're not. And digital is an area where pharma is not focused on and not doing well. So we, as a fund, have begun to look at a couple pillars, like using real-world evidence, thinking about how you have trials faster, quicker, cheaper, to shorten your timelines because of patent life. So we're using the fund as a vehicle to access this innovative technology and companies to be able to help Sanofi have access and provide earlier insight into this and start to partner and bring these in.
Great, thank you. So Claire, can you talk about how Samsung thinks about its life sciences and investments, especially given the traditional tech focus of the company, and how that influences how you think about the companies that are interesting for you?
Yeah. Yes, thank you. So hot areas, the way we look at it for us is more hot questions and business. Samsung is really business driven, and they look at industries in a pretty agnostic way and identify areas for growth. And so bio and life science been identified as like healthcare has been identified as an area of needs and of potential growth. In terms of the way we look at things, we've identified the same question that probably this audience has identified and discussed it since this morning. That's everywhere in regards to like the efficiency of the development and how can we affect that. We have a manufacturing business unit specialized in biologics. They're certainly wanting to collaborate, provide strategic input to development of startups and assets. And so that's how we see the world in terms of strategic investment is basically we invest for small stakes usually, and the condition that we want to meet is like it's going to be a very valuable partnership for both one or several business units from the Samsung conglomerate and the portfolio company. And that's going to be revisited and grow with opportunities. And so we want to be together in success. That's what we want to do. And so the initial condition is really for the strategic conditions to be met. But then the entity I report to is a venture firm. And so we definitely want to invest for financial success, and we're looking at everything that everybody here is looking in terms of exit and returns. How we look at life science specifically, so I mentioned the manufacturing plant, Samsung Biologics, and we also have a biosimilar company, Samsung Bioepis. It's actually a joint venture with Biogen. These are the first foray into life science and drug manufacturing development. This is typically the way Samsung look at the world. They develop platform and knowledge, and then they try to tackle new area. And so one way to do it is really to enable others. It's like making new friends and making them access your tools and your people. That's what we're trying to do.
Can you tell us about a recent investment that you've been involved in?
In life science, we're really starting. So
Okay.
we have discussions that are close to closing. And conclude, hopefully. It's a little bit early. We've been active in digital health, definitely, and in many other connected area because we have business units specialized into wearable and health monitoring through, for example, a watch. Or we have a previous investment in diabetes monitoring with WellDoc, or in diet coaching with Noom, for example. That's what we've done so far, but we certainly are looking at increasing this presence, make it more impactful, I'd say.
Great, thank you. Mike, maybe you can tell us about a recent investment that you've been involved in?
I was hoping to talk about one that hasn't quite closed yet, but
We're all friends. You can tell us.
we're almost there, I think. I think Jason brought up expansion. We've got a similar company in the space called Ribometrics that I've been heavily involved with, and several people talked about people, and we don't, because we're seed and early stage investors, we don't always have the luxury of having a management team already in place, right? I mean, many times these are technologies that haven't been licensed into companies yet. There's founders, there's scientific founders, but we're really tasked with building out the team. And but I think the people part still holds true, and you want to find the founders that you enjoy working with. I mean, oftentimes there's an SRA with their lab. Sometimes they're on the board of these companies, are otherwise heavily involved, and so you gotta want to work with them, right? And this space that Jason mentioned, using the tertiary structure of RNA and drugging that with small molecules, we're going in a different direction from expansion. But I think we spent a lot of time with Kevin Weeks and Katie Warner, his postdoc at the time, who are the founders of Ribometrics, and that was sort of over the course of a year and a half, right? And part of that was for the entrepreneurs in the audience. It's a little bit of a test when a venture capitalist tells you they want to see something. The next time you come back, they want to see it, right? And it's sort of a listening test. The challenge is Jason may tell you one thing and I may tell you something different.
No, we're all very consistent.
No, but I think they were great listeners, and really we saw them. They had the ability to execute, and what they were doing was super interesting. We wanted to be in the space, and so that was the bet we decided to make. And I think we had our seed round came together very organically while we had been following the company, sort of independent of us. And this is maybe atypical of a lot of the seed deals that we work on. But AbbVie had become interested in the deal, and Chuck Kunsch here. Chuck and John Gustafson really led that effort from AbbVie, and then Mike Ross at SV Health Investors. I know Kate is here. We're just phenomenal partners. So that seed round came together. We did a $7.5 million seed round to sort of to answer some fundamental questions early on, and that's typically how we work. So even the seed rounds are tranched, and we lay out goals and milestones for the company to achieve, and we want to see them achieve those or come close at least. I think we do go alone sometimes on seed investments. It's helpful in this case. SV, Mike and John and Chuck in particular have just been phenomenal partners, and they helped us in the early stages to negotiate the license and pull together the management team and all the things that you need to do to sort of get a company off the ground. And that's not always the case. Oftentimes we're doing that alone, and that's why I may do one or two of these company formations a year. And that's about it. So.
Great, thank you. And so I'm going to come back to the group with some of the points there, especially the licensing at a university, since we are at a university where many of you are doing that, and what investors think about with respect to those licenses and the terms that matter. But first, maybe Jim, you can tell us about one of your recent deals and the structure that Royalty Pharma looks at.
Sure. So it probably is appropriate that I'm the last of the group here, because we are thought of, we're perceived of as being late-stage investors, and many of our historical investments were actually on products that were on the market at the time that we made those investments. But really what we're doing more and more is working with development stage compounds and being an alternative to equity financing or dilutive equity financing, or partnering or debt as other financing tools that companies have. We wouldn't be viewed as an alternative to those as really asset-based financing, really the ability of investors to invest directly into a product in a company's pipeline, and the ability for a company's management to only give up any kind of economics on one asset, as opposed to kind of tapping the overall company and all the assets of a company by doing an equity raise. So it's a really interesting model, and I think really as our industry becomes more disaggregated over time and companies are more open to different ways to finance both at a biotech stage and also at a pharma stage, that this asset-based financing mechanism will become more prevalent. There are probably 25 deals that I could point to in the last 5 years of examples of this, and probably, actually we've done about $1 billion of that. I think the whole field is probably $2 or $3 billion at this point, so it's becoming real. So the example that I would talk about that I think is probably most interesting, since we're talking about kind of earlier stage things, is one of our earliest. It was an investment that we made on a cancer product when it only had about 40 or 50 patients worth of data at the time, but it's Immunomedics' product called sacituzumab govitecan, which is an antibody drug conjugate to the TROP2 target, which is expressed in triple-negative breast cancer, probably broader breast cancer also, and urothelial and a variety of other cancers that the company wants to go into. So they needed about $250 million of capital to finish development and be ready to launch this product. They could have gotten that by issuing equity. They had about a $2 billion market cap at the time, so to raise $250 million in the market would have been 12+% dilutive to the company. And really, as I mentioned, touching all of the pipeline products as opposed to a single one. So we offered them this alternative to just raise that $250 million just on a single asset by selling us a strip of future revenues on that product. So it wasn't an existing royalty, it was a royalty that we created, a synthetic royalty that basically allowed them to pull forward future revenues and have that money now to finish development. So actually, after diligencing and discussing, we landed on 4% as the royalty rate that we would need in exchange for that capital, and now we're completely passive. So we gave them the money, and we hope that it works out. Actually, it did have a little bit of snag recently where they got a complete response letter from the FDA for manufacturing, although the clinical package and safety package looked fine. So we, if I were an equity investor, I'd probably be a little more bent out of shape about that, because you're more near-term focused as an equity investor, but because we're so long-term, I mean, our investments are for 15-year horizons, that we view that as kind of a blip, and it's really more of a when, not if thing that happened with that product, that we're still very happy with that investment. And I think the company's happy also. The stock has gone from $2 billion to $3.5 billion in the time that we made the investment. An analyst came out afterwards and said they viewed that as a nice way of raising non-dilutive capital without partnering the product and kind of losing control of it. They regain all the control. We're at risk if something goes wrong. The investor is. So it's a really, I think that's a good example of this new type of mechanism of structure that's available to companies. And as I mentioned, we've done about $1 billion worth of these types of deals, a couple with pharma, Pfizer and Sanofi. And then we also did one just since I was here last year with a New Haven company called Biohaven, which actually bears a lot of similarities to the Immunomedics example that I just mentioned. So it was a $150 million deal for a 2% strip of future revenues of their product, which is a oral CGRP, which we're super excited about and just had great data at AAN recently. So those are examples of the sort of things we're looking at. As you can tell, we're not therapeutic area dependent. We are really interested in a lot of things. Cancer actually accounts for probably half of our pipeline right now, just because it's so prolific in the overall industry pipeline. And thankfully, we work in a world that is a capital-intensive world. So companies are going to be using all of our different types of funding over the years. We're really just one of the many tools in people's armamentarium to fund all the way to the market.
What stage of development do you usually come in with those sorts of deals?
Well, the two that I mentioned were phase 3. I should say Biohaven was just out of phase 3, and Immunomedics was in phase 2, but with a trial that qualified for breakthrough and a product that qualified for breakthrough. So they filed on phase 2. So I call it phase 2 if I want to sound early, and if I want to sound late, I'd call it a pivotal trial. But depends on my audience.
And the only economics then were the royalty stream. There weren't milestones like a collaboration would look like. It was just a royalty stream.
I mean, there was some equity at a premium in there also, but no, it's pretty free and clear except for the royalty, and we didn't take a board seat. We get periodic reports, but they're very informal. So it's about as no strings attached as you can imagine.
So keep that in mind. So $150 to $250 million for a 2 to 4% royalty, and then we're going to turn to university licenses. So Mike, since you look at those a lot, what are the important pieces of those to you when you consider these companies that are forming? Are there terms that, the numbers I assume, but other things that you think about in those university licenses that are important to you as an investor?
Yeah, a lot of these things, sometimes we get in before there is a license agreement in place, and so ideally that's the case because then you can sort of direct it and hopefully make it a little on our side of fair, right? I think oftentimes there is a renegotiation of the license, and upfront payments are part of that. I mean, it's important for tech transfer offices to recoup their sort of sunk IP costs, but that upfront has to be is right? Especially for a seed investment where the capital really is best spent on advancing the technology, right? Sub-licensing upfronts, sub-licensing royalties oftentimes have to be renegotiated. And then, milestones, right? Because I think when we get involved, sometimes the strategic direction that the founders start out with is not the strategic directions that the investor wants to take, right? And so those milestones are not necessarily applicable anymore, and so those sort of have to be reset and calibrated and appropriately sort of back-end loaded, right? As you continue to raise more money, you actually can afford to make those milestone payments. So those are a few things.
Okay. So Jason, since you do earlier stage investments, is that something that's important to you? If companies are based on university IP, what the terms of those licenses are?
Yes.
And so which pieces do you, okay, that's it. So which pieces do you focus on?
Look, I think Mike's spot on. I would say Yale, for example, we've got a great relationship with the team here, I think is very reasonable, right? In terms of understanding that these projects are risky, these are early, and so you realize what's important to us as venture capitalists, which a lot of the time is, right, equity capital from us is expensive, right? Like this is money that comes with strings, and strings which are a lot heavier than some of our colleagues at Royalty Pharma. And so for us to have cash come out of the company that can be funding trials, preclinical experiments is painful. And so I think all the stuff around Mike's talking about sub-licensing, et cetera, we can work on, but I think the cash up front and the cash that comes out in the near term is one of the hardest things. As a pharma, right, we think differently about this, right? Because we as investors will negotiate something and say, well, I don't really worry about the phase 3 or the marketing or your success down the road commercially, because that's going to be dealt with from my parent company or others.
So Pete, what about you? Do you want to weigh in, Alex? Go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say, usually the economic terms, if it's out of market, if you show up and say, hey, we have a big venture round, you need to change the economics, that'll usually work. I was going to say the two non-economic things that we run into, the biggest one that's a deal killer is IP, and the professors published something too early.
Yeah.
So I always tell professors, if you think you have any good idea, talk to your tech transfer business development group before you start publishing, but it's hard to sometimes get that through. And then I haven't actually run into it in a few years, but there were a couple of universities who were taking very strong positions on controlling manufacturing for Biotech. It hasn't come up. I don't know if you've seen that recently. But
They have to manufacture in the US.
Yeah, that's a big issue to sign up for that before you know anything about the drug.
And I guess, Pete, I was going to ask you, because I know you advise companies in connection with their IP, and if you advise in this space as well.
We're not. We leave IP to the IP experts. But I think from a strategic perspective, from technology being incubated out of universities, right? Just an example of a route to pursue that isn't necessarily company formation. I think we advised a group at, with apologies to everyone in the room, at Harvard, in the chemistry department, an investigator named Matt Scher, who had some strong chemistry around CDK8 and 9 inhibition, and was really looking to not necessarily go the company route. And what he had available to him was a pot of money from the Blavatnik Accelerator at Harvard, really to put money around in what is differentiating of this deal compared to a lot of the other early stage academic deals, was putting a lot of the investment in IND enabling GLP tox, such that really they were looking, and we helped advise them on the deal, for a more biotech-like approach for out-licensing the asset and asset series to Merck for $20 million up front, with back-end biobucks that looks more like an early stage asset that would have been incubated by a VC group.
Yeah, and so I think a lot of the issues that we see are based on those back-end deals, right? So we do a lot of the collaborations for biotechs with pharma, and the issues come around, like you were saying, Mike, around the sub-licensing, both limitations on sub-licensing and having to go back to the universities for permission to do that, or the revenue shares that go along with that. And in my experience, a lot of investors are strongly opposed to those large percentage shares because it takes away from the value that comes back into the company. And so just interested to hear your perspectives there. I think another question that comes up a lot for our early stage clients is about the process with engaging with folks like you, and how long does that courtship process typically take? When do you, or how do you become interested in a potential target of investment? So would be interested to hear thoughts there. Maybe Claire, if you'd like to start on that one.
Yes, so for us, really, the clock starts ticking when we've done somehow a match, like between a potential portfolio company and an area in which we are active or interested, and it could be any of the 40 plus business units. So the lead time to get there can be very long, and I think it's not bad because we get to know the company, the management, we can monitor the progress, and we all do that basically. But then when that match kind of occurs and there is mutual interest, then it can we're not the quickest. It can take up to 4 months, 5. Could be longer.
So I've heard 18.
Some people say they can do better in the tech, like my colleagues who are more tech focused can be quicker.
Right.
I think life science, we have a little additional things we like to check. And so, yeah.
Right. I think that's probably right, and would be interested to hear the perspectives. I think what Alex has said about wanting to see data, and what you said, Mike, about saying these are the action items, can you act on those, that's very much a factor in how long you talk to a company before you invest.
I mean, I think there are 3 things I'd say. So generally, right, the process is a 9 to 12 month process. But as you talk to funds, I've seen and monitored companies for 4 years, right, before we've invested or engaged. But the 3 things I would say is, 1, start by asking the investor what stage and what type of deals they do. Because most entrepreneurs can probably cut off, 50 to 80% of the investors that they're not going to do that type of deal. So I think just ask that question up front to save you time. I think the second thing is, I spend some of my time outside of work raising money for not-for-profits on the education side. And we have a saying in that world where if you ask for money, you're going to get advice. Whereas you ask for advice, you're more likely to get money. Yeah. I think it directly correlates, right, to venture capital fundraising. So don't go in starting to ask for money. So you probably get advice. And so I think you start out by getting advice. And then what Mike was saying, you start delivering over a period of months, years, whatever that is, to whatever stage that investor likes to do, and you're more likely to get capital.
Did you want to weigh in as well?
Yeah, so I always tell entrepreneurs or science folks or whatever, this is not something you should stress about. venture, what's the right way to say it? It's like to what Jason just said. We don't do really early stage stuff, but we love to see it, right? Because it educates us, starts to build a relationship. We take notes, and then a company comes back 2 years later or 4 years later, and they say, hey, we said we were going to do X, and we did X. Or they say, well, did we say we were going to do X? X isn't valuable. Forget that. It's Y that's valuable, and that's what we did. So you can save a lot of money by lopping off 80% of the people, but you lose that opportunity to start building the relationship. The other thing that folks stress about, I tell them don't bother, is I find entrepreneurs spend an inordinate amount of time trying to find a personal connection to network. It's fine if you can do that, but otherwise you can just cold call or cold email. I mean, it's nice not to have it be a form thing, but just say, hey, I saw you made an investment in X company. I thought that was really interesting. We're doing something semi-related or whatever. But I wouldn't spend more than a few minutes going through LinkedIn to try and find a connection, because we'll try and keep an open mind about anything, no matter where it comes from.
And for you, Jim, since you come in later stage, to the equivalent of phase 3, essentially, how long do you watch a company before you'll decide to do a royalty sort of investment?
Well, I kind of, for our existing portfolio and for new ideas, we like to stay apprised of the science and everything that's going on. So I would say our deal cycles are measured in years, but part of that is following the product by going to AACR and ASCO and all the meetings and everything. And it's staying up on the field and on the unit. So and that's how we got to know. Imbrubica is one of our investments that we made a few years ago, and it was also in phase 2, about the same as the Immunomedics product when we made the investment. But we had been following it since it was preclinical, practically, and we just had an idea that this is going to be a great drug, and it's going to be a real drug. And the question is, how do we find a way, into it? We try to do that more of sort of a bottom-up analysis than a top-down analysis of, getting a call from a banker and saying, like, here's the opportunity, yes or no. We'd rather sort of stay in control by, what are the great assets and how do we find a way into them? Mm-hmm. And sometimes we find an existing royalty on it somewhere by studying the literature, and we found a scientist who, did early work on it. We call them, and sometimes it's by creating the opportunity ourselves through a synthetic royalty that we just make with the management, of the company. But that takes time also, because you got to get the board comfortable with, or you got to get management comfortable with something that's, not totally down the fairway of all the investment options that they have, and you got to sort of show them the precedents and show them, this is safe and it's an okay thing to do. Precedents mean a lot, with particularly boards. So all that education, if I actually would consider that part of the process that we go through and part of our deal cycle. So that can take time.
Yeah, so it sounds like the takeaway is it's a long conversation, right? And there's a life cycle to the investment in your company that you may start that conversation with someone like Jim very early in the process, even though you may be a later stage sort of investment strategy for the company later in your life.
And I think for our fund, if I remember correctly, over half our investments were with a company we'd reviewed in an earlier fundraising round. Mm-hmm. So it's not all wasted time, if you get to know. You might get free advice or build a relationship.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say for us, I mean, there's a huge swing in the time that it takes, right? I think, about, maybe about a third of our deals we'll do with someone else leading, right? And so when, a lot of that diligence has been done and we can piggyback on that, we can move really quickly. And I think, probably the shortest time period is a few months, right? But then, the other end of the spectrum for company formation and sort of, helping groom these companies over time is like Jason said, it's years. One point I might add on top of Alex and Jason's comments are, do your homework sort of in advance of going to visit with a venture firm and know what their portfolio is and sort of the stage at which they invest. And then, that sort of arms you with the ability to ask intelligent questions. And so I think that, that when you sort of come in and just say, what do you guys like to invest in? Right? I mean, do your homework ahead of time, and that certainly helps make the time fruitful. Yeah.
Great. So we have about 10 minutes left. I wanted to open it up for questions. And if you don't have any, I will ask some more. But if you've got some, we're happy to direct that way.
Hi, are you seeing a difference in the equity stakes that public and private? Are you seeing a difference in the equity stakes that public and private universities are taking, public versus private? And secondly, what would you consider as current market terms for public and private universities demanding regarding equity stakes?
Have you been planted by the office?
I see John up there, he's listening.
So are you asking, are there differences between public and private university asks in terms of equity?
Right, and well, regardless, whatever the answer is, what are you seeing as current typical equity stakes being given by companies that are coming out of university labs
So I can
Yeah.
answer that.
to the university?
Yeah, there's a wide range. Go ahead and I'll fill in.
So we see probably 100 university licenses in a year at the firm. And I don't see a difference between public and private universities that is identifiable on that basis. The range is 1% to 8%. We do averages. It's 2% to 3%, but most universities start higher than that. And the other piece of it is how long does their anti-dilution protection last, which is meaningful, which means they get to keep that percentage for up to a threshold of equity investment that the company receives. The averages that we see are in a similar range, 2 to 3 million, but they do range quite a bit, and I am seeing those numbers go up.
3 million for up to 3 million for the institution.
Right. That's what I've been seeing. I'd be curious what this group has seen.
Huge range. It really depends on technology, professor.
And it depends on where the company is in its life cycle. If you've already got some investment, that makes a big difference as to how meaningful it is to get that equity stake, and then the numbers should be different and reflect that.
We have seen some universities that have started to avoid an equity piece because of the perceived conflict and sort of replace that with some sort of success fee. That's happened in a few cases. I don't know, Bora, if you've seen.
The other thing that's circling back is what started out as an assignment fee and then became an assignment or a change of control fee, and now is, what do you call it, an integrated milestone, where it effectively gets around any dilution by just setting a payment that is either just a number or it's a percentage of the change of control purchase price or even an IPO in some instances. Those are challenging, I think. But the universities have realized that they get diluted because they're coming in early, and so they've come up with backdoor sorts of ways to keep that potential for upside. And that varies dramatically by university. So many still do not have anything like that. The trend had been a fixed dollar fee. Northwestern started with 10% of your acquisition price. They never get that. But they do get a percentage usually. UCSF has that milestone that I described. So they're kind of figuring out and testing where the bounds are, and they change.
Hi, so you mentioned that you will sometimes invest in companies with early technologies, like maybe 150 million, in order to get like a 2 to 5% return for the revenue. I was wondering, how do you exactly hedge for risks if, for example, the technology doesn't come to fulfillment?
Is that for me? Okay, I think that's for me. So 2 to 5% royalty, I would say, as opposed to a return. We got to make a little bit more than that return-wise. So we actually, on the whole continuum of needed return, are still probably on the low side of that. I would sort of for approved products, we're probably like high single digit, and that the sort of counterbalance of that is that we're in those cases not taking a ton of risk, right? Because the product's either close to approval or approved. So not many of those will fall out of bed, right? And then on the ones where we are taking more risk, we'll get a little higher return than that. We're still not taking swing for the fences risk. We're sort of batting for singles and doubles, right? So those would be doubles. But we just hope that diversification helps us if something doesn't work out. So we need to be placing a good many bets, and I should be doing like 3 of these a year just to make sure that when one doesn't work out, it doesn't mess up the portfolio.
Hi, this is great. I think we need to wrap up because we got the next thing to proceed to. So let's everybody thank you, Farah and the whole crew. So we have our keynote speaker starting in 4 minutes. So don't run away unless you absolutely must. But we have a full. Hello. We have a very full house that we have a whole bunch of people that are going to come in here to get seats. So if you are sitting in rows and there are empty seats in the middle of those rows, could you please move in from the aisles towards the middle so that we don't have to have people climb over everyone to try to find a seat? Also, please come down to the front. There are free t-shirts for everybody who sits in the front row.